Welcome to Green and Red, scrappy politics for scrappy people. A regular podcast on radical, environmental and anti-capitalist politics. Brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host Scott Parkin in Berkeley, California tonight. And as always, I am joined by
Bob Bazanko in Houston, Texas.
And folks, today we're going to be talking about the recent election in Argentina. Joining us is Dr. Rodrigo Acuña, who works as an independent journalist on Latin America, based in Sydney, Australia, and is the host of the Indestructible podcast. And he's been writing on Latin America for close to 20 years. But welcome back to the Green and Red podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Maybe just to kick it off a little bit, maybe we could actually just talk about some of the political and economic conditions, social conditions which exist in Argentina in the run-up to this election, which has led to this sort of self-styled far-right libertarian to be elected president with 56% of the vote, which is also mind-boggling as well.
It's a story that you have to go back to the era of the military dictatorship, because that's when Argentina took out some very large loans from the IMF. And those loans have taken on different shapes, different forms, but essentially the country has been in debt for decades. And every couple of years, you will get an extreme right-wing candidate that comes along and promises the solution. The solution is structural adjustment, harsh and neoliberal economic policies, a restructuring of state spending, and that's the cure. That's the pill, the harsh pill that the Argentines need for the country to get out of this crisis. So if we move to the more recent era, the President Macri, or if you go back a little bit further to when Cristina Fernández de Kirchner was in power, and then prior to that, her husband was in power, Argentina actually managed to pay off its foreign debt to the IMF, put together the money and said, here you go, here is what you've been asking for, leave us alone, we're done. That solved the problem with paying the IMF. It did not solve the problem with paying private creditors. Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, she ended her term in office and still refused to pay foreign private creditors, and was playing hardball with them. By that stage, the center-left Peronists, because we need to talk about what is Peronism in Argentina and how did it come to dominate Argentine politics. By the time she steps down, the center-left Peronists had consumed, they had spent a lot of their political capital. And along comes Macri. This is, again, one of these neoliberal figures like Carlos Menem in the late 1980s. He's the one that carried out massive privatization in the 1990s. He comes in and he establishes a payment system. He actually borrows money from the IMF again, and he gets the country again into further debt. So they've got the private debt, but now they've got state debt. And when the center-left comes back into power, they are not able to solve this problem, which is almost an impossible problem to solve. Because even if you do pay off the state debt, you still have private creditors that you need to deal with. Now, when Néstor de Kirchner was in power between 2003 and 2007, Argentina actually experienced its largest growth, roughly 9% GDP a year. And that was the largest growth that the country had seen since Juan Perón was in power between 45 and 55. So the cycle is, and I'm sorry if I'm extending myself, but the cycle is that roughly every 10 or so years, a neoliberal ultra-right president comes into office, promises to solve the country's foreign debt, but then ends up privatizing, once again, state assets, and then the country ends up crashing and going into default. And then you'll see center-left Peronists come into power and then try and rebuild local infrastructure, renegotiate foreign debt, and stabilize the economy. But then in the long term, that problem can't be solved. So that is why we are now in an era of, unfortunately, Javier Milei, who is promising to abolish something like 9 ministries. He's already conceded that he's not going to abolish the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Education. And I think that some of his more outrageous statements, they're just simply not applicable on planet Earth. But large unemployment in Argentina, massive inflation, and a disenfranchised youth who has embraced his political rhetoric. And they're the ones that have formed the backbone for voting him into office.
He's calling himself an anarcho-capitalist. What does he mean by that? What's that mean?
It's rhetoric. He talks about freedom. Every speech that he gives, he says that he is pro-freedom, and the state has been too imposing on Argentine society. The problem has been that there are too many restrictions, there are too many trade barriers. The trade unions in Argentina have held a long presence in the country's politics, and they're a problem. So he calls the political class, and in that he includes the trade union movement, he calls them la casta, the caste. And they are the fundamental problem to the country's economic situation. He doesn't talk about foreign creditors. He doesn't talk about the IMF. He doesn't talk about agribusiness inside Argentina, which is extremely conservative, recalcitrant, long ties to the military dictatorship. He doesn't talk about those players as being the real power players, the elites of Argentina. He talks about the politicians, which come and go, can be different stripes. And he talks about the trade unions and bureaucracies which are linked, which are part of the state, and in many cases have been part of progressive governments, and them doing things like handing out weekly or monthly bonuses so people can basically put food on the table. So that's why he classifies himself as an anarcho-capitalist, and he's on repeat his rhetoric. I'm pro-freedom. And he makes these outrageous statements about that once he is president of Argentina, he's immediately going to break all relations with China, with Cuba, with Venezuela, etc., which is ridiculous because China is one of Argentina's largest, if not its largest, trading partner. So there's a lot of rhetoric there behind what he says, but it's fundamentally empty in terms of him being able to execute a lot of these policies. What I do think he's going to do is he will try and once again dismantle as much as possible of the state sector by carrying out large privatizations. He said he's going to privatize the state oil company, and I do think he's really going to try and do a lot of those things.
Yeah, I think I actually saw in the. Oh, go ahead.
This is actually, I kind of want to go back just a bit before we talk a little bit more about him. I'm just curious about the election, because in the first round, I believe the kind of center-left candidate at 36-30 was the leading vote getter. What happened in that fairly short interim to create such a huge, I know the person who finished third endorsed him, but was there more to it than that? He won, like, really convincingly. I think all of us thought it would be very close and we're holding out hope, but it was like a blowout.
I think the Argentine media is incredibly influential, and the biggest political scalp has been Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, because she was the wife of Nestor Kirchner, and she is part of the harder left within Peronism. This is a couple that came from outside of Buenos Aires and took on the establishment, and not only the establishment inside Argentina, but also the IMF, Bush when he was in power, and they were absolutely loathed. So once Nestor passes away in 2007, she ends up taking over the more progressive side of Peronism, but the attacks against her have been relentless. So basically now there is a judicial process which is underway. I would argue it's politicized, claiming that she was involved in numerous acts of corruption. And basically it's just attempting to remove her from the political scene. Now, when the current president comes into power, he did not appear to have the same sort of the same sort of teeth that the Kirchners had. He carried out policies, but he fundamentally ended up negotiating once again with the IMF. And that disillusioned, I think, a lot of voters, because not having that political will and then starting to roll back some of the benefits of the state, then again, we see this trend of the country becoming poorer. Bolsonaro was in power in Brazil. And when things were best for Argentina under Nestor Kirchner, you have to remember that this is the height of the pink tide. This is when the price of oil is high. Venezuela was actually able to support Argentina in paying off its foreign debt. So a lot more things were happening at a regional level, and that was fundamental to stabilizing the Argentine economy and actually helping people climb out of poverty.
My next question is, he only got 30% in that first round of the national election. He's actually, his coalition, LLA, is actually fairly weak in the National Congress, 40 seats out of 257, 7 out of 72. What, with things will be difficult, and social movements on the left, trade unions, et cetera, are still strong in Argentina. I'm curious what he's going to start trying to dismantle things, but I'm wondering what damage will he actually be able to do? Like how, like he sounds much weaker than past presidents. I'm curious about what you think the results will be, the impact will be.
Yeah, he is weak in the sense that his Partido Libertario did not obtain the number of seats to control Congress, but he's forming alliances with the different sectors of the right, of Peronism. So he's claimed, whether he's able to do it or not, I don't know, but he has claimed that he is going to try and dollarize the economy within a year. And he said the first 6 months are going to be incredibly hard for average Argentinians, but he has the support of the military. So if the Peronists, the center to the left Peronists and the trade unions take to the streets and carry out massive demonstrations, then it will be law and order. And he feels confident that he has the support of the military. So he's fundamentally preparing for a shock doctrine, as to use the term of the IMF and the World Bank. But again, whether he's able to successfully carry out those policies does remain to be seen. If he is successful forming these alliances with the right and with any sectors that are willing to defect and join him, then I think he'll try and push as much as possible in terms of privatizing sectors of the economy, because Argentina at the end of the day is a country that produces an incredible amount of wealth. So that's why international markets, for example, have reacted very well to his election. You would think a guy that's, giving press conferences holding a chainsaw and making all sorts of ridiculous statements and claiming that he cloned his dog and he speaks to his dog, and that his nickname in Spanish is El Loco, the crazy one. You would think that international markets would react differently, but they understand that that's just rhetoric. What's fundamental, is he going to dollarize the economy, which would be a massive prize, a massive triumph for the establishment in the United States, and obviously the private sector and the elites of the country. But again, whether he's able to do that, it does remain to be seen.
He said he wants to destroy the central bank. Is that a central bank, the Fed, or is it actually like a state-run central bank?
It's a central bank, but the policies are formed independently. So you've got, yes, it is part of the government, but for many years, like in many countries, they develop their own policy and they'll take certain recommendations from the government, but they run on their own track. His claims that he's going to blow it up, it's nonsense. This is a lot of huff and puff rhetoric. Who I think the ministries that he will try and dismantle are the ones that engage in social spending. Okay, it's not feasible to dismantle the Ministry of Education, but he'll try and sack X number of bureaucrats he can get rid of. It's not feasible to completely dismantle the healthcare system of Argentina, but he will try and dismantle whatever he can of that ministry, and on it will go. Ministry for Women, Ministry for Culture. I mean, it's very famous. There's a video there where he goes through the different ministries and he rips it out and says, this one's gone, this one's gone, this one's gone. And there was one ministry where he couldn't pull the sticker out of whiteboard. And he said, despite your resistance, you're still going in the bin. We're still going to get rid of you.
How have social movements, unions, communities been responding to this? At least what kind of, are they putting out like a defiant message, or are they battening down the hatches, preparing for the worst, or I guess all of the above?
All the above. And he didn't win his votes in Buenos Aires, in the capital, actually low. So he's obtained a lot of support from the provinces outside of Buenos Aires. And I think certainly I would be shocked if the next 6 months to the next year, Buenos Aires doesn't come to a standstill, because I definitely think there will be massive demonstrations. Unfortunately, I think there is a generational change, and the younger generations have not been incorporated successfully into the traditional political left in Argentina, and they've become disillusioned with them, and that's why they've given this gentleman free rein. That's why they've voted him into office with a proposed very radical program, which will immediately hurt them. That's the only sort of logical explanation. There's also a battle for Argentine history, and he's very much aware of that. And his vice president belongs to an institute which supports the study of the victims of left-wing terrorism prior to the years of the Argentine military dictatorship. And he himself, Milei, claims that the figure that's generally given, roughly over 30,000 Argentinians were tortured and disappeared, murdered during the junta. He says that that figure is incorrect. The number is more along the lines of, I think he claims it's about 13,000. Now, that figure is actually not disputed. There's plenty of credible research that has been done to say that, yes, it was easily over 30,000. Some put it over closer to 40,000, but it was in the tens of thousands. And it was brutal, and it was targeted not only at leftist guerrillas in the 60s and 70s, but it was targeted at trade union leaders, at any sort of leftist or progressive members of different organizations. It was aimed at eradicating the political left in Argentina and progressive sectors. So he's part of that as well. And because the younger generation, he's part of that debate. So because younger generations have not been, as I said before, I think successfully incorporated into the political left inside in Argentina, that's why they've tended to drift and given Milei the vote.
Is there much of a legacy, or is there still power in the memory of the dirty war and kind of the move toward democratization? Or it sounds like he's really done, unfortunately, a good job of kind of eliminating that historical memory.
It's really interesting, because if you compare Argentina to Chile, in Argentina, Videla, who headed the junta, his last days were in prison. He was actually eventually, despite the fact that Menem in the late 1980s pardoned the generals, he was under the Kirchners, put on trial and imprisoned, and to the point where he actually died in prison. So there was a lot more accountability for people that committed crimes during the era of the dictatorship, in contrast to, say, Chile, or forget about talking about Guatemala or Salvador. That's far worse. But despite those successes, the battle for memory, I think for now the pendulum has swung towards the right, where a lot of people, the younger generations, have not been successfully educated into understanding what that era meant and what occurred and the ramifications of that era.
And this leads a little bit to my next question, which is that he campaigned against on social issues. He campaigned against LGBTQ communities. He's a climate denier. He campaigned against gun control. Abortion was legalized in Argentina in 2020, but he campaigned against abortion. And in many parts of the world, amongst under 30s, these are progressive issues in which they embrace. Are we not seeing that in Argentina, or did they just ignore his position on these social issues?
They actually supported. They actually supported him. So he has been able to tap into, and I think really the word is manipulate, the anger of Argentine men and saying, look, the real problem is not the fact that the government has not been able to play hardball with the IMF and foreign creditors. The real problem is that now you have to respect the rights of the LGBTQ community. The real problem is that abortion has been legalized. The real problem, and it's shifting politics away from issues of class, issues of economics, structural issues, and moving them towards issues of identity. So that's the real problem. That's your real problem. And instead of the left, I think, successfully countering that and saying, this is really fundamentally a distraction, he's managed to, at least for now, win that debate or obtain the upper hand.
I was going to ask you that, I mean, what the left's response was to that, because, we're seeing something obviously similar to that in the U.S. and the Democratic Party is hapless, but my sense is that the Kirchner's-Fernandez wasn't, that you actually had more legitimate left than you would, let's say, in the U.S. Was it just a failure to take it seriously, or did the educational sector, the unions take that on, or was there just no real resistance to this kind of these identity issues, or whatever you want to call them?
Again, there was resistance. There was a lot of resistance, but the correlation of forces were huge. I think that after the big crash of 2001, the Argentine political right decided to stay at home for a while. They lost so much political credibility that it was hard for them to come out and say, this is our agenda, because their agenda had been followed almost to a T, to a letter. That's what you prescribed, and that's what was done. And I think even the IMF called Argentina the model pupil. So if you've had these policies, you've been promoting these policies for decades, and you've been able to carry them out, and the result is that the country has to default on its foreign debt, then your policies are rubbish. So they retreated. But as I said, because the Kirchners were in power for several years, and it was a team that Nestor was in power first and then Cristina, the one that they really went after was Cristina. And the fact that she's a woman is just...
Wasn't there an assassination attempt?
Well, exactly. So a few years, there was actually even an assassination attempt against her, and she's only alive because the gunman, I think, gun jammed, or he took the safety off or something along those lines. But they've been going after her for a very long time. So the fact that she's still around meant that Milei can target her and again say she's part of the problem. She's part of this identity politics problem, and that's why we need to get rid of her. We need to get rid of her government, and we need to get rid of those policies. But fundamentally, it's a distraction.
One thing, I have a colleague who lives actually in Buenos Aires and was messaging with them recently, and they were actually telling me that we're also now starting to see sorts of gangs of right-wing hoodlums who are harassing LGBTQ centers, soup kitchens, things along those lines. And similar things happened here in the US after Trump's election has opened up the ability for the right on the street, I guess you could say, just like really feel empowered and start challenging whatever protests or bastions of the left or whatever. I'm curious to see if you think that we're going to see a phenomenon like that with Milei's election begin happening in Argentina.
Oh, definitely. And then that in fact occurred during the COVID lockdown. So he actually staged the protest outside the presidential palace. I think it was 2019, 18. And it was only a couple hundred people, but the media coverage that he received was massive. So then he started a trend, Twitter hashtag, that the country was in lockdown because of the COVID crisis. And he was able to garner support. And again, always using the rhetoric of it's about freedom. They're taking away our freedoms. We need to get rid of this government. We need to get rid of the big state. And Argentines have, at least the younger generations, have actually forgotten that Argentina has done better economically when there is a large state. It has done a lot better when the state begins to nationalize certain strategic industries and increase tariffs and attempt to develop a local manufacturing industry and play hardball with international creditors than a country that begins to privatize things just left and center. That's always been the recipe for disaster.
There's a lot of media comparing him to Trump. I think Trump's going to go visit soon or something like that. But one thing that's
Congratulations.
interesting is here in the US, Trump, who has this crazy base, right? But among what I call the ruling class, he's actually not well liked. The elders of the Republican Party hate him, and they'd like to get rid of him. Wall Street can't stand the guy. Jamie Dimon has been really vocal about that, and they're reaching out loud to Nikki Haley now to try to find some kind of alternative. Is it the same with Milei? Does he have? There's with Trump, I think there's this level of instability. As much as when Wall Street, when he first came in 2017, you get these tax cuts, and I think it was Blankfein from Goldman Sachs who said, "We'll make a deal with the devil to get the cuts." And after that, the guy made us crazy because he destabilized everything. Is that kind of a possibility where these forces which support him right now may find out that he's just created such chaos that it's not worth it anymore?
If he does really end up consolidating his power base, that he does begin to create chaos, they'll get rid of him. Latin America has a long tradition of carrying out military coups, either hard coups or soft coups. So they in comparison to the US, I would say that, and I agree with your analysis on the perception and the relationship that certain elites, economic elites, have in the United States to Trump. I think you have to remember that Trump is, when someone becomes the president of the United States, in contrast to becoming the president of Argentina, one is running, yes, a very large and powerful country in South America, but nonetheless a third world country or a developing country. The other one's running an empire. So it matters more who is in charge of the United States than it does in Argentina. So I think for now, the business community in Argentina have backed him. They've reacted well to him, and so have international investors. So the thing is to see how much of the economy can he privatize? Can he dollarize the economy? And if so, they'll be happy. And if the story plays out as it always does, that the country defaults, once again, Argentina has something like 8 or 9 historical defaults, then they'll be fine. They'll be okay. The economic elites of Argentina will be fine because their assets are in foreign banks to begin with. They are just administering the country. They're managing the country. Their connection to Argentina and wanting to develop the country, they gave up on that project decades ago.
Kind of getting towards the end of my questions. I don't know if Bob has any others.
I have 1 or 2 more.
Yeah. Okay. My question is thinking about this, kind of going back a little bit to this sort of like revising, having a revisionist view of the dictatorship, thinking about the sort of like this surge of right-wing hooliganism on the street. I'm curious how you see, how are human rights going to play out in Argentina? If we have a strong left, we have the military is supportive of Milei, like how are we going to see a sort of, in other parts of the world where we've seen these like right-wing politicians come in, we've seen extrajudicial killings, we've seen like an enhanced police state targeting political opponents. I'm curious how you see the sort of human rights scenario playing out.
Certainly the minister that was in charge under Macri, herself actually a former leftist in the 70s, but then became a member of the hard right. She gave we call in Spanish, we say carta blanca, free range to the armed forces and the police to carry out massive repression against people that were protesting the Macri government. So I think they certainly will. They're preparing for that. Milei's first interview, he said, I watched it yesterday, it only came out 2 days ago, he said that he's preparing for very tough first year, 6 months, and that if the left Peronists decide to take to the streets, then it will be law and order. So certainly human rights, there will be human rights violations. Now, if we go back further into Argentine history, unfortunately, this is really one of the core problems of Peronism, is that Juan Perón, the great general who eventually became the country's president between 1945 and 1955, he empowered trade unions. He allowed trade unions to be part of the political scene in Argentina. He certainly contributed substantially to developing the country. If you were to ask me, which 2 governments could you point to, or which 3 governments could you point to that actually improved average people's lives in Argentina, I will definitely have to include Juan Perón. But there were also many instances where the trade unions would take to the streets and there would be fierce pitch battles with the political right. So it was seen as acceptable to take to the streets with a baseball bat and club your political opponents over the head. And that, although that violence in recent decades or after the dictatorship certainly decreased, it's never fundamentally gone away. So this idea that it is okay to engage in a peaceful demonstration and the police forces do not have to be called out and dispersed of the demonstrators, even though the demonstrators may be completely peaceful, that political environment has never really been seen as something acceptable or natural. And it's certainly the case throughout many Latin American countries. Chile, that's certainly the case. You'll see large, very peaceful and organized demonstrations. And even though they put in the right permits, the orders come from the local commander or someone higher up. That's it. This street needs to be cleared. And then all hell breaks loose. Tear gas is launched. The dogs are set on protesters and massive repression takes place. So I certainly think that an increase in human rights violations will take place under Milei. He's aware of that. He's aware that his policies are going to hurt. And he claims that there's no other solution. The debt has to be paid off. So there's no money. Country has to be restructured. If you do that, if you're going to start sacking people left, right, and center from a large state bureaucracy, those people will take to the streets. They will demonstrate.
Just a couple of questions which are a little disconnected, but not too much. First, I haven't really followed this all that closely because Gaza essentially is dominated, right? It's consuming all of us. So I'm not really aware of what the U.S. response has been, what Biden's response has been. I'm assuming obviously they'll recognize the government, but is there any indication? I think it was important for Biden to immediately recognize Lula in the election last year in Brazil. But what's the U.S. kind of approach right now to this new government in Argentina?
I think the US is always happy when there's someone in Argentina that's willing to pay the debt. It's as simple as that. They don't care whether it's a center-left government or a center-right or an ultra-right government. As long as that debt is paid, then there's no problem in Argentina. When you get a Kirchner in power that plays hardball with the IMF, that plays hardball with private creditors, and they're willing to fight it in New York courts, then that's a problem. That's a problem. Now, of course, President Kirchner in Argentina and Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, they never had that rhetorical style of Hugo Chavez or Fidel Castro, where it's us versus the American empire. But their policies were certainly those. They understood what the relationship was between the United States and Latin America historically. But because they didn't have that rhetoric, then the response from Washington was never the same, in contrast to when Chavez would make a statement about numerous issues, domestic or regional or global. But the reaction is always in Washington, I would say, it's going to be positive as long as those debts are serviced. When those debts are not serviced, then there's a problem. But since there really hasn't been a president in Argentina that's had a fiery rhetoric since, again, you'd probably have to go back to Peron in the 1950s, then the response from Washington hasn't been the same.
So if Milei does blow this whole thing up, that would mean getting rid of regulations and investment regulations. I think are you going to see like a rush of U.S. investment coming in, just flooding into the area?
I think it'll be a repeat of 2001. I really do. If he really does go through with a lot of these policies, sure, he'll service the debt, but people are going to be put into absolute grinding poverty. And one of the biggest problems is capital flights and the restrictions. So as soon as things become unstable, people pull out their money, and then that destabilizes the whole thing. So it's a house of cards. Argentina has long been a house of cards, and that debt needs to be serviced. But unfortunately, for that debt to be serviced, if you're going to apply neoliberal free market economics, then that's going to hurt people. So I do think people will react. The interesting thing will be, A, how far he's willing to carry out his program, how much of it he's willing to privatize, and then B, how the population will react. And I don't think they will react in a positive manner.
We've seen a number of center-left governments be elected amongst his neighbors, Brazil, Colombia, Chile, in the last couple of years, within the last year, a couple of them. And I'm curious, how are, and I think there was even talk of a Brazilian Argentine common currency, the sol. I'm curious how you see his neighbors responding.
Not in a positive manner. This is bad. This is bad news for the Latin American progressive forces, because for things to really start changing and getting interesting at a regional level, you have to have Argentina and Brazil on board. They are the powers of the region. And if they don't have progressive governments in office, then that's when things start falling apart, and things, regional integration, a lot of the policies that Venezuela was putting forward when President Chavez was in power, they flourished. They had some successes precisely because there was a Lula and there was a Kirchner in office in Buenos Aires. So definitely not good news. Again, whether Milei goes through with closing, I don't think he was going to close diplomatic relations with China, but he'll certainly do things like he'll cut diplomatic ties with Cuba and with Venezuela, and then he'll withdraw Argentina from any progressive sort of regional organizations. Now with Israel-Palestine, he came out with a flag of Israel flying, and he's totally on board with Israel and the United States on that issue. So regionally, definitely not good news for progressive forces in the region.
Now, is the election kind of unique to Argentina, though, or does it have meaning, to go follow up on what you just said, for the larger pink tide in Latin America? Do you think this could filter out into other countries as well, this kind of reaction?
Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, he was in office for one term. And I think because he wasn't able to go through with successfully carrying out a coup or stealing the elections, he's backed down. That hasn't helped the regional, but Milei coming into office in Argentina will help the regional right. The problem is, how successful can leftist and progressive governments in the region renegotiate their foreign debts? How successful can they form trade alliances? How successful can they take on domestic elites? So in the case of Bolivia, the Bolivians have actually been quite successful, despite the fact that Evo Morales there was a coup d'etat in Bolivia in 2019. Their economic policies have brought about a lot of positive consequences for Bolivians. But Bolivia as well, you have to remember that, yes, it is a mineral-rich country, but it's nowhere near as strategic as, say, a Brazil or an Argentina. So it's complex. There are a lot of moving parts. I personally worry if a country like Argentina or Brazil not only has a Bolsonaro in power or Milei in power, but then if they're able to truly consolidate an authoritarian regime and then suspend electoral politics. If they do that, then we could see, I think, an emergence of fascist regimes, outright fascist regimes throughout the region. And there are certainly forces inside the region that would love to see that happen. They would not have a problem with having the military out on the streets again and just getting rid of trade union and leftist and progressive political forces. Not a problem at all. They can be shot. They don't care. They stuffed that up in 2002 in Venezuela when they carried out a coup against Chavez. They weren't successful. They stuffed it up in Ecuador in 2008, I think it was, 2009. They stuffed it up in Bolivia. I think they stuffed up because they've tried to. And Peru, exactly. They've stuffed up because they've tried to carry out softer coups. It's not a good look if you have the armed forces and the air force of a country bombing the presidential palace and the president dying. That's not a good look. You don't want that. So I think what they've tried to do is they've tried to carry out constitutional coups, softer coups. But if their backs against the wall and they feel they do have the support and they can carry out, and it is necessary to carry out violent and brutal coups d'etats, then they will. So that's my biggest concern. One of my biggest concerns is if a Milei or a Bolsonaro try and win office, but then after that, suspend.
Thanks for joining us today. Folks, we've been talking about the recent Argentine election of Javier Milei. If you like what you're listening to, please check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, please hit that subscribe button. And if you're listening to us on the audio platforms, please give us a rate and review. It helps with the algorithms. And if you really like us, go to greenandredpodcast.org and hit that support button or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. Dr. Acuña, it's been great talking with you today. And everyone else, go out and misbehave. And we'll talk to y'all again soon.